Good day. This is a recorded lecture for Chapter 13, which talks about restoration ecology, and it's assigned for week 8 of the course. I'm going to do a little departure in this lecture. I'm going to go through the material, but I'm going to introduce some additional examples of restoration, including one that I was involved in the late 80s and 90s. That is an example of a local example. So your book case study talks about the Louisiana Gulf Coast, which I think is a good one. It's the poor Louisiana coast has been in the news over several years now, with first Katrina and then the oil spill. When Katrina came through, that was one of the discussions that was taking place in the recovery, is that some of the horrible losses that occurred in that city was due to the lack of the buffering effect of the wetlands that had been degraded over the many years of development of this part of the Gulf Coast. So this was one of the factors that caught the public eye, was the erosion of the coastal marshes that once protected the coast from storm surges. This coastal wetland system has been radically altered in that region. The Army Corps of Engineers straightened and contained the Mississippi River outlet. So levees now guide the river to about 50 kilometers out into the Gulf. So what happens is that all the mud and silt that once sort of deposited offshore is now dumped further out. So that sediment isn't there, and so there's not a substrate to develop these coastal marshes that provided the buffering effect. They've also dredged and filled many of the wetlands. So the oil and gas companies have dug canals deep into these wetlands, allowing boat access to the oil and gas wells. So these now sort of perforate the region's wetlands. So as a result, the freshwater marshes now cover less than 1/4 of the area that was present about 60 years ago. So the damage caused by the Gulf oil spill in 2010 sort of added urgency to these efforts to reverse or at least slow this coastal wetland loss process. One of the first steps that they took was to close what's called the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, which helped guide the storm surges into New Orleans. That has now been closed. So this canal destroyed thousands of hectares of valuable cypress swamp by flooding them with salt water. A more difficult proposal is to close and restore some of the oil and gas canals. And who should pay for this is also disputed. So the work continues, but it's an example of how restoration ecology is a new and exciting field. This is a map in your book that has the current and projected losses of coastal marshes in this region. So let's look at the relatively new field of ecological restoration. This field attempts to do restoration based on both good science and pragmatic approaches. And some see this as a kind of a new aspect to conservation biology, but in general, what you want to do is to try to avoid doing this. But I think we've degraded so many areas that embarking on a restoration project is well worth the effort. So this is kind of a model, and I think the best way to study this is to start with at the bottom with barren site and kind of go up the middle and then look at the different approaches you can take on the outside. This is a useful model, I think, when you approach restoration ecology. And the key to this is matching, pragmatic techniques to the goals of your restoration project. Restoration in general can be relatively easy up to very ambitious, but any kind of restoration project takes resources, and with limits of resources, you have to make sure that you know that you're going about it the right way. The restoration to an original condition is almost never possible, but looking at this this progression here, I think if we move towards healthier ecosystems in more places, then the restoration would be well worth the effort. This is table 13.1 in your book, and it examines different terms in a glossary of restoration terms. So again, a restoration effort should be carefully planned, and the level of restoration that's trying to be achieved should be carefully worked out. So your book does explain that restoration projects range from modest to ambitious. So sometimes you can just remove the stressors and let nature take its course. Sometimes you can just control invasive species, and that will do it. Sometimes you may have to replant, and then you might have to go further than that. You might have to reestablish the animal community on top of that. The previous discussion talked about goal setting and setting appropriate practical measures, but monitoring your restoration efforts is also important. This photo is from the Aldo Leopold Legacy Center. We mentioned Aldo Leopold in Chapter 1. So let's kind of look at upland restoration quickly. In restoration, we make a distinction of uplands from a stream or coastal area, where the techniques used are quite different than when you're actually working with a water course or a water system or a wetland system. In upland restoration, you're really looking at the terrestrial values and techniques, but then when you get into water courses, it's a whole another set of concerns around the hydrology. So I'm just going to mention the Pelican Island case. Your book talks about it. It was one of the first wildlife refuges established where restoration techniques were used, and it's an example of a success story. I also mentioned in the previous lecture that the state of Vermont has reforested a good part of its original forest. So like I said, these restoration efforts can be quite powerful. So upland restoration can include protection measures, restoring native species, prescribed fire, restoring forests, and restoring prairies. So now we're going to kind of walk through some of those techniques using the Pelican Island as our first look. And again, you can look at your book for more on this particular project. As I said, this was one of the first refuges. This particular bird, Cahows, returned to Nonsuch Island in Bermuda after restoring the native vegetation. So you'll see this, if you restored the food source, you can often pull the animal community in. They used labor-intensive methods to trap the non-native predators out, the invasive species that were affecting the native bird population. And this was also an example of a restoration project that, like many, are heavily dependent on volunteers to uproot or remove exotic or invasive plants and then replant the native plants. The Bay Area is actually an area where some active restoration is going on, which we will examine a little bit later. Go Native is an example of a local company that specializes in restoring native habitats. As I said, these projects are very dependent on volunteers. Another well-known project is the Greening the Great River project out of St. Paul, Minnesota. Basically, a lot of that river area was restored, and again, it was dependent on thousands of volunteers to grow and plant native species in the place of invasive and more non-biological kinds of riverfront areas. These efforts aren't confined to the United States. As mentioned before, the Kenyan Greenbelt movement that was founded by the late Wangari Maathai. 600 local women have managed to plant more than 30 million trees in Kenya and restore forests. Yosemite National Park is an example where prescribed burning has been used extensively to restore forests to a more natural condition. One of the things that we've talked about is about how fire suppression has led to many of our forests in California and in the West being choked up with more trees than were natural. Not prescribed fires, but fires would naturally burn and clean out a lot of that before. But now that we suppress fires, our forests are generally a little bit more dense than is their natural condition. John Muir wrote about how he could ride his wagon through the forest, that the spacing was that wide that you could drive a wagon through it. That's certainly not the case now. And he also talked about being able to ride his horse through a forest when a forest fire was actually occurring. And that's because the forest fires would burn quite coolly because of this wide spacing of material. There wasn't a lot of material to sort of support a large crown fire. So burning promotes meadow growth, and it gets rid of a lot of these, quote, weedy trees that grow in between the more mature trees, and it reduced the risk of catastrophic wildfires. And the parks are using this extensively because a catastrophic wildfire is much more troublesome to a national park that gets a lot of visitors than a less damaging fire. And with prescribed burning, you can manage that. This is an example of a prescribed fire and then what kind of growth you get underneath it. Fires either naturally or through prescribed means, burn a lot of sort of weedy herbaceous and small weedy kinds of trees in these forests, and they mineralize a lot of the nutrients in these places. And you typically get a growth, flush and growth of more desirable species, like these lupins shown here in the foreground, which are better for wildlife and other species, other organisms. So this is a technique that is often used by resource managers. You can be trained in prescribed burning techniques as part of an educational program. Your book also talks about the Some Prairie Grove, where spring burning was started in 1981 in an effort to preserve and restore a more open tree environment again. And as a result, they monitored the efforts. So this research program monitored the results of the restoration effort, and transects were established and sampled for a wide variety of biota, trees, shrubs, herbs, invertebrates, birds, and small mammals. And this occurred over a 6-year period. So the results of this survey are shown in this figure, and it generally indicates that if you look at biodiversity by using the Natural Area Rating Index, which measures the frequency of native species associated with a community, that the increase of native species is improving significantly under this kind of restoration regime. This figure in your book talks about the Great Prairies of the Great Plains. The eastern edge of the Great Plains, which was covered by the tall grass prairie shown in orange here. And some of these grasses reached heights of 2 meters, that is 6 feet. I've been in a restored tallgrass prairie that was accomplished at my college that I went to in Illinois to get my undergraduate degree, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. These tallgrass prairies had roots of more than 4 meters long, and they formed the hugely rich soils that we now take advantage of in our grain-producing regions. Less than 2% of these original tallgrass prairies remain. The middle of the plains contained a mixed prairie that was not quite as tall. As you march west, the heights of the grasses get smaller and smaller. So we call the mixed grass prairie in the middle there, and then the short grass prairie as we get further west. In California, we had our own variant of a prairie. We called it the coastal prairie, or the California native bunchgrass prairie. Your book talks about a particular restoration project up in the upper left here, at the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge. I'll let you kind of take a look at that. What I'm going to do is feature a California example, which is called the Jepson Prairie. It's about 10 miles south of Dixon, and you can actually go visit there. It's currently managed by the Solano Land Trust, but it was originally established by the Nature Conservancy through a purchase of land. So in parallel fashion to the example in your book, I've featured a map and some pictures of the Jepson Prairie. The Jepson Prairie preserves a unique feature in California called vernal pools. They were associated with our bunchgrass prairies, and they supported our Native American populations and large grazing animals and migratory birds. The vernal pools form in a particular type of soil type that has a clay hardpan underneath. And during the rainy season, because of the minor changes in topography, these depressions form and they fill with water during the rainy season. As these pools dry out, they support a very unique type of plant life that tends to be different species at different elevations of these pools. And of course, these elevations are only are minor differences, a couple of meters or so. And as these pools sort of dry out, these species complete their life cycles and they bloom. So they form what we call fairy rings. So you can see in this picture on the bottom left how this fairy ring appearance occurs, and you can see a partially flooded pool there. So there's very few of these left, and so the Jepson Prairie is one of our best examples of a preserved prairie vernal pool complex. So I would suggest that you go see this. The techniques that were used to restore this had to do with some fencing, grazing management, removal of non-native species, but for the most part letting the natural system sort of recover there. This is the example of the restoring the tallgrass prairie at Green Oaks Field Station, which is a natural resource study area that's associated with my alma mater, which is Knox College. I participated in this work, and it still goes on today. I've included some sort of shots of the tallgrass prairie just from a distance here, and then a little bit fuzzy picture of a tallgrass prairie next to a kind of a dirt road, just to give you the perspective of how tall these, tallgrass species really are. And of course, in the middle are some adults sitting in the some of the tallgrass prairie. The particular version that we had at the field station here, some of these grasses are over 8 feet tall, so you actually disappear when you're walking inside them. So you can see how lush and productive they were in their original form. This is Dr. Peter Schramm, who was my professor down in the lower right-hand corner here. He's a professor emeritus now, but he still consults on prairie restoration. He's considered an expert. And he is a contemporary of Aldo Leopold's son, Stark Leopold, who was at Berkeley. This is a current picture of the students burning the tallgrass prairie at this field station. I participated in these burns when I was there. And so this is a case where they did prescribed burning. They sort of eliminated the farming that was here at this field station beforehand. They collected native grass and wildflower prairie plants from old cemeteries where, some of the remnants of the prairie still remained, and in some cases some railroad rights of way. And I recall the tallgrass prairie being pretty well established here when I went there. And one of the interesting things was that we started trapping some of the prairie organisms, such as this southern bog lemming. They had not been known in the area. They've been thought to be extirpated from the area, and they started coming back once the habitat was restored. So this is just an example of how restoration can be very effective. So your book also talks about wetlands and restoration of wetlands. Restoring some of our wetlands back to health is particularly important because so many of them have been destroyed. Part of the problem was the U.S. Swamplands Act allowed draining and filling of these important ecological habitats. But in 1972, that was reversed in the Clean Water Act, and we currently have a no wetlands loss policy. So we are trying to get wetland acreage back. So 700,000 hectares have been added to the U.S. total. So we're reversing this trend. Wetland restoration, again, involves water, so we've got hydrology and ecology issues we have to deal with. There are some major efforts to restore some key wetlands. One of them is in the Everglades, and again, your book will give you some more details about that. But one of the things that we've learned as we divert rivers to control flooding or channelize them to get them to the sea, we hurt our own built environment. One of the things that happened with the Everglades in an effort to manage the water and get them away from people, the water storing ability of the Everglades was lost. And so the communities there started suffering water shortages because the holding capacity of water in the Everglades was not being realized. So they're in the process of trying to restore the Everglades to a better ecological function, but also improve the water supply outlook for the human inhabitants of this area. So this figure shows the historic flow of the river systems through the Everglades and the current flow regime, the way it was changed and altered, and the planned restoration work to sort of try to restore some of that historic flow. So ironically, some of the things that we think protect the built environment don't help us. One of the reasons why I put the Mountain View Sanitary District on our field trip list is that artificial wetlands can also filter water and clean up water. So Mountain View Sanitary District is an example that uses an artificial wetland as part of its treatment sequence for sewage water. So I hope those of you who want to go to that field trip. Streams and rivers, another area of restoration. Many of our streams are what we call channelized. We did this in order to control flooding, but we had to return those streams and rivers to cement canals that rush rainwater off to a large body of water. In the course of doing that, the water goes faster, and more water is actually pulled out of the system, and then it's not available for other beneficial uses for wildlife and for plant communities, but people as well. So stream restoration has become an important part of an opportunity for environmental professionals, and many cities are rethinking this policy. So the first thing we have to do is restore the actual channel and how it used to function. So various techniques are used, and going back to the original sort of goal planning discussion we had in the first part of this lecture. These programs can be very ambitious and require major engineering, or they can be quite simple. Just depends on where you are and what you're doing. But there's ways to set up barriers, bundles, various ways to create rooting vegetation, root wads, to slow down the water and trap the sediment so these streams take on the original plant community that they might have had. Some of these streams require more engineering. You have to actually install barriers appropriately designed across the water to slow it down, or in some cases to speed the water up so it doesn't deposit sediment in places that you don't want it. So there's all kinds of what we call bank stabilization techniques, and there's terms associated with them. Straw bales, planted willow poles, rock structures, gabions is another term that are used for these. So this is a picture in your book of a lunker structure, which is another technique to provide better habitat. And it's a wooden structure that's partially submerged, and it has rocks on the top, and then some vegetation, and then there's an opening to hide fish. So this is a diagram that looks at the amount of engineering required depending on how the angle, how steep the angle is approaching your stream. And so this illustrates sort of the careful level of planning up to engineering that may be required to tackle some of these problems. So I'm going to feature briefly a specific study that I worked on in this area. This is Red Clover Valley, which is northeast of Quincy. It's kind of just on the just east of the High Sierras, but the streams from these areas actually drain out through the Feather River. And this is the valley and what it looks like before we started the restoration project. And we've covered the biomes. Before I go to the next slide, you might want to think about what biome that reminds you of. So this is in 1988 when we first started funding and thinking about restoration. And this is the same area, a little bit closer up. You can see from the mountains in the background of the area after restoration has occurred. And you can see the dramatic difference in the results. So here's before, here's after. This was an example of a project that we had to have sort of some low-level engineering and biological or biotechnical techniques. So one of the things we had to do to begin restoration of this stream was to figure out how to slow down the water so it wouldn't keep cutting these very wide stream banks that you see here. So what you can see going across the middle of this slide is what we call a check dam. What a check dam is, it's a rocky dam that's constructed across a stream, and you might think it's not doing much good there because you see that water can easily flow over it. Now that's the idea, because when you're trying to slow down a degraded stream, it's usually wider and faster than you want it to be. And so the idea of the check dam is that water can easily flow over it when you have high flow, so the water doesn't actually remove the dam. But in low flow periods, the water sort of backs up and slows down. With access to water, the natives and streamside vegetation can start building back into the system. So this is kind of a schematic of the check dam. So the idea is that this was designed so the spacing was such that the toe of the upstream dam is the same elevation as the tip of the downstream dam, so you can see that. And that basically achieves the objective. And again, these had to be engineered for us. This is a shot a little bit later on, and what you can see in this shot is the check dam with the water backing up. And you can see the wetland vegetation starting to come in and fill that stream channel and make it a smaller stream channel. So those are cactus or tules coming in there. And so as the water slows down, more of the water is retained in the system. It sort of fills up the water table, makes the soil a moister environment, a more moist regime, and therefore the wetland vegetation can come in. In the background you can also see a fence, and part of this effort was to fence and control the amount of cattle pressure actually occurring on the stream itself. We worked out an arrangement with the cattle operator at this site. So this is another shot after restoration, and you can see that the wetland vegetation has pretty much filled in. You know, you see a little bit of a stream going through there, but it's a much healthier and much more productive system. So these types of projects are happening in many places. This is part of the Orlando, Florida, Everglades effort. But you can see the footprint of the former canal and restoration of sort of a natural stream system there. So the canal was removed, and then the stream starts to meander, and you can see that it creates a lot more habitat that's a lot more suitable for wetland values and species of wildlife and so on. This is just another schematic showing how streams with vegetation and natural vegetation on the banks is generally healthier for the stream. You see that overhang of vegetation in the photo keeps the stream cool, which is better for fish. And part of the erosion pattern is with these streams, all these streams are going to erode even without interference from humans. They're naturally eroding and they change, but they tend to scour under the roots of these different species, and so they create these sort of hiding places for fish and these cool refugia that many of these fish depend on. And so the stream actually creates these natural lunker structures, as we showed you in the earlier slide. This is an example of some simpler biotechnical techniques that have been used at San Pedro Creek, which is in Pacifica. And what these are pieces of willow poles, we call them willow poles. They're just small willow trees and the trunks are cut up. And willows are natural riparian species, and so sections of a willow that breaks off will actually root and establish itself and grow more willow willow trees. So these are willow poles that are kind of cut in that crossing position that you see, and they're actually hammered into the stream bank. And then the smaller twigs are sort of bundled in and put underneath there. So all of that material will grow and form a natural green barrier and to help stabilize the eroded stream bank that you see on the right there. So that's been done. This type of technique has been used successfully in smaller creeks, like Pacifica. They've had volunteer workshops where these have been put in. This is an example of the same thing back at Red Clover Valley again. And in this case, we used a little, we had a little bit larger stream, a little bit bigger cut banks. But these are actual pine and cedar thinning cuttings from the Forest Service, who thinned forest out of some of their area to make that a more healthier forest. And we took those long poles, which were probably 15-20 feet, and drilled a hole in the butt ends that you can see sticking up there, and then we cabled those back onto the bank. But what happens is that area becomes a place where sediment gets trapped, and then it slows down the water, and then of course the riparian vegetation can root in that. So these are just some examples of these biotechnical techniques that are used in stream restoration, and they can be very effective and not too costly in some cases. This is a map of the San Pedro Creek Watershed Coalition, where they're doing the restoration in Pacifica, and I've put a link to their website on in your FYI section to look at that. And this is an example of a rebuilt bridge system that allows fish to move up that creek. So this is the last slide of the presentation. I've given you an overview, and I hope you read the chapter, but I wanted to give you some more local examples of some of these restoration techniques and how they're used. Humans have caused massive damage and degradation to many of our stream courses in particular, but there are ways to repair the damage. Ideally, we would like to avoid that, so the discussion we've had about preservation of not only species habitat but also landscapes is important. But we can make efforts to return some of these areas to a pre-disturbance condition. We might not be able to go completely to pristine, but at least we can make things better. And I like the quote in your book. Restoration pioneer Aldo Leopold wrote, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." So I mentioned Aldo Leopold in the first chapter, and I thought it would be good to associate him here with Dr. Peter Schramm and also his son, Starker Leopold. Some modern ecologists object that ecosystems are highly dynamic, and species appear and disappear stochastically and individually. Characteristics such as integrity, health, stability, beauty, and moral responsibility tend to be human interpretations rather than scientific facts. But we can still have goals for restoration that the public can understand and accept. The ecological restoration projects currently underway, and there are many in the Bay Area, tend to be sort of grassroots, volunteer-based. So if this is something that you're interested in, I suggest that you might want to get involved in a restoration effort. They're very rewarding and I think particularly important. So on the website, again, I've suggested some sources that you can go to look for those opportunities.